Good evening, I'm Graham Ward and welcome to our talk on Anne Baker. In fact, this evening it's three for the price of one. Myself, Bob and Kayley will each cover a different aspect of Anne's life. So without wasting much more time and explanations, I'm going to briefly introduce Anne to you. Many present-day residents of Northampton will of course know Hazelrigg House in Mayfair, but possibly know little about the house's former residents. It's sometimes known as Cromwell House, based on a tenuous and undocumented connection with Oliver Cromwell. The Hazelrigg family, previously known as Heselrigg, lived in the house from at least 1667 until 1817. And after standing empty for many years, number 33 Mayfair, as it was then known, was sold in 1831 to Mr. George Baker, a local historian and antiquarian. For the next 20 years, 33 Mayfair was to become the home of George and his sister Anne Elizabeth Baker, who died in 1861. George had died 10 years previously. The Bakers were a couple devoted to the history, culture, and heritage of the town and county. And there are several dimensions of Anne's life, as we shall see. But first, I'm going to look briefly into Anne's family. George and Anne were the children of Richard and Anne Baker. Richard had originated from nearby Harpole. He was christened in Harpole on the 30th of October, 1747, and was the son of John and Elizabeth Baker. Richard Baker's will tells us that he still owned property in Harpole. This was in 1806, and that property was the residence of his brother, William, who's not actually shown here. Richard and Anne were married in 1777 in Barby, Anne's home parish. They had at least 4 children. Esther, who we discover from her father's will in 1806. George was born in 1781, and Elizabeth in 1786, who we'll be focusing on this evening. And Richard was born in 1792, but sadly died in 1793. Neither George nor Anne married. One particular important aspect of George and Anne's life was their church life, and it was very important to the Baker family. But it was complicated. Now, what this map attempts to do is to show you some, not all, of the chapels in the area of the town that we affectionately known as the boroughs. It's not all of them, there are others. Could spend a whole evening talking about those. What was particularly interesting is that George was christened at King's Head Lane Independent Chapel, which stood on the north side of King Street, as we probably remember it, somewhere just behind where the school clinic was located. But 5 years later, when it came to Anne's christening, she was christened over at Castle Hill Independent. And when it was time for George's younger brother, Richard, to be christened, this was 1792, the family were back at King's Head Lane. So why 2 independent chapels so near to each other? Well, there'd been a major rift in the church at Castle Hill in the 1770s, resulting in a major court case and the departure of the then minister, William Hextall, who along with many church members went off to King Street, King's Head Lane, and founded a new church. There had been tensions at Castle Hill for many years previously over issues such as Calvinism and Arminianism and the principles of congregational organisation and the structure of the church. Interestingly, but during this time, relations between Castle Hill Independent and College Street Baptist Church, which is not shown on this map, were actually quite cordial, evidenced by sharing of buildings, joint Sunday schools, preaching in other chapels. So you can appreciate that people tended to move around and circulate among these different chapels. These theological differences perhaps seem insignificant to us today, but they were extremely important at the time. And things moved on, and at some point, George and Anne Baker changed their allegiance once again, crossing the road to the south side of King Street and became Unitarians. That aside, they still lived in Mayfair, very close to St. Peter's. That's where this arrow is on the right. This is Hazelrig House, and St. Peter's Church is here. So you can see how close they were to the church. I've mentioned Unitarianism. I just ought to sort of explain just a little what it's about. Unitarians basically deny the Trinity. That's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And it challenged the belief both of Catholics and Protestants. And in fact, as early as 325 AD, the church councils decreed that Unitarianism was actually a heresy. So you can appreciate becoming a Unitarian really put you on the fringe of the Christian sort of sphere of denominationalism. So really much outcast. So it's perhaps surprising that we find that George and Anne are so involved with their local Anglican church. So finally, we arrive at St. Peter's, where we find this splendid memorial tablet to George and Anne. The tablet can be found on the south aisle of the church, and in some ways, this is an example of the esteem with which they were held by that community. Being Unitarians, it is remarkable that their efforts were recognised here. George, however, was actually buried not in St. Peter's, but in the family vault at King Street Independent Chapel. So that's where he was christened originally. And Anne, when she died in 1861, was buried at Billing Road Cemetery. But her grave, I understand, was cleared in the early 1960s. It's mostly laid to grass now. In some ways, it's sad that there is little more tangible evidence of Anne that we can see. And in fact, to my mind, this tablet itself is perhaps a little bit of an embarrassment and an understatement in Anne's respect. But we're hoping to put that right this evening. So I'm going to hand over to Bob, and Bob's going to tell you something of a couple of aspects of Anne's life, covering geology and natural history. Thank you.
Well, I've been asked to talk about Anne Baker's role and significance as a natural historian. My interest in this was originally sparked when I was looking into William Smith's life and his death, and wondered why it was that he had died in Northampton, and looked at William Smith's nephew, John Phillips, who recorded in his biography of William Smith that William Smith had been good friends with George and Anne Baker. And I began to wonder on what basis that friendship was and how it had become established. And the more I looked into this, the more I thought that it was Anne as the natural historian, rather than George, that was the significant link. Although, as we'll see as we go on, brother and sister were in many ways inseparable. So I'm going to pick up 4 themes that make up Anne's contribution to natural history, though I think there might be a 5th, which is her botanical interests, but I don't have any evidence on that. But I think that's one of the questions that will remain hanging at the end of my talk. So I want to talk about her knowledge of the work of John Morton, firstly, then the links between the Bakers and William Smith, a collection of Northamptonshire fossils, and finally her links with other significant figures in the mid-Victorian geological establishment. But perhaps first, I'm just going to put up a timeline just to talk about the sort of period and how lives overlapped and didn't overlap. So clearly, John Morton was operating about 150 years before the Bakers. He's our historical figure, if you like. And William Smith was born perhaps 20 years before the Bakers. But but otherwise we're very much in that era from 1790 to 1850. Firstly, to John Morton. John Morton was the 17th century natural historian and author. His dates are 1676 to 1826, and he was rector of, he was initially curate and then rector of Grange Oxenden near Market Harborough. And he wrote an amazing work stretching to over 650 pages. It's an amazingly detailed account of the natural history of our county. It's quite clear he spent more time collecting evidence on the natural history of the county than he spent caring for his flock. Baker certainly had a complete knowledge of John Morton's natural history. But it's just worth looking at this book because it does say something about the amazing. It is an amazing book for 1712. The bit here that is significant was his just attention to detail across the county. As to my own performance, I have spared no pains. I have visited not only every town and village in the county, but every quarry, wood, and spring, and to be short, everything that could merit remark and observation. And it is an amazing work of observation and description. And of note are his amazing illustrations of local fossils. These are some bivalves and again, some more. They're just remarkable illustrations. And I think this must have been what interested both Anne Baker and also William Smith. We go on and just look at George Baker's great work, which is History and Antiquities of the County of Northampton, which was published in 1822. Anne added the natural history sections on each village and manor within the book. And in his introduction to the book, into his foreword, George Baker pays tribute to his sister's contribution. Natural history, so George Baker says that natural history, though not strictly within his province, has not been altogether excluded, and he has incorporated the most interesting notices in Morton, the lists of scarce plants, fossils, and birds, where no particular reference is made, are contributed by his sister, who is his constant companion of his topographical excursions. So clearly, all the entries in the book relating to natural history come from Anne, and in each section there is a reference to natural history. So next, I want to go on, and actually, William Smith was particularly interested in, well, there were three main influences on William Smith's sort of understanding of geology. Plott's Book of Oxfordshire, Woodward's book on fossils, and Morton's book on the natural history of Northamptonshire. So I think it probably was Anne Baker's knowledge of Morton that could well have linked William Smith and the Bakers, because he would have gone to her to talk about this. But also, she had a very significant fossil collection. Some of this is in the Northampton Museum, but important items were purchased by the British Museum and are now in the Natural History Museum in London. And this is the inventory from the Natural History Museum listing the fossils that were brought from Anne Baker. And just to note that at the top of the page, you can see that they were purchased from Miss Anne Baker. This is page 71 of the Natural History Museum inventory. And if we look further down, we will see the humerus and ichthyosaur. So along with elsewhere, molar tooth of an elephant. So some sort of wonderful fossil specimens, either Jurassic, so that's about 200 million years old, or Ice Age, about a million years old. So two groups of fossils, Ice Age fossils and the Jurassic fossils. You also know that, if we can go on, that here is a bivalve, and my hunch is that this is one of Anne Baker's fossils because of the way it's labelled. This is a fossil bivalve collected from the Kilsby Tunnel when it was being dug back in the early 19th century, and I'm pretty sure this is an Anne Baker fossil. Then there's her Ice Age fossils, and here we have a drawing from a drawing from a note on the fossils within the British Museum, noting that it was collected from Miss Baker of Northampton.
Oh, look at that!
So Miss Baker, here we have elephant and rhinoceros specimens that she will have collected. She'd have collected them probably by having a relationship with every village would have had a quarry in those days, and Anne Baker would have had a relationship with the quarrymen so that a few pence would enable her to obtain these marvelous specimens. So I'm suggesting that Anne was among a distinguished group of Victorian women fossil collectors, alongside Mary Anning from Lyme Regis, Charlotte Murchison, and Elizabeth Philpott. Although I don't have any evidence of Anne being in direct contact with them. But we do have evidence that she was in contact with some of the foremost Victorian geologists of her age, and it's quite a remarkable list. It includes William Smith, John Phillips, who was Smith's nephew, Professor William Buckland from Oxford, William Fitton, and Louis Agassiz, the French geologist. So I'm going to look at those each in turn. We've established that William Smith was a regular visitor to Hazelrigg House, and among his county maps is a map of Northamptonshire, which was never finished and never published. This is the unfinished version, which is in the Oxford Museum of Natural History. You also know that Anne had some connection with the shaft being dug at Kingsthorpe, where they were trying to see whether they could find coal. And there was the amazingly named the Northampton Union Coal and Mining Company, which is now in the grounds of Kingsthorpe College. And it says here that Miss Baker collected a specimen of probably Triassic conglomerate from 900 feet down in this shaft, and that the section, the location of the shaft was supposedly made by Dr. William Smith, and that had been in the hands of Samuel Sharp, who is another important Northampton geologist. Hear more about this from Kayley, But here we have from Anne Baker's Glossary of Northamptonshire Words and Phrases, a reference to redbacks. I insert this on the authority of my friend, the late Dr. Smith, the geologist, who informed me that he heard it used in the neighbourhood of Silverstone. And actually there's reference to that penciled in on his map of Northampton as well. So, nephew John Phillips records Smith visiting Hazelrig House on several occasions. And we know George Baker assisted Smith in his financial troubles. Smith ended up in a debtor's prison at one stage. But it was in 1839 at Hazelrig House, on a visit to the Bakers and on his way to the British Association for the Advancement of Science in Birmingham, that Smith, at the age of 69, was taken ill and died. We have a very detailed account from George Baker of William Smith's last few days, including a last ride out on a chaise to Beausiet, accompanied by Anne as they went fossil hunting. Another important name was Dr. William Fitton, a doctor at the Northampton Infirmary under William Kerr. He was recommended by Lord Spencer, coming from Dublin and having trained in Edinburgh. He had a difficult and unfulfilled medical career under the difficult Dr. Kerr, but his extramural activities were more rewarding, and he was involved in the formation of the Northampton Provident Bank with George Baker, and William Fitton chaired an early 19th century meeting of the St. Peter's Restoration Committee. So given Anne Baker's involvement in removing plaster and whitewash from the St. Peter's Church, he and Anne Baker must have been good friends. Fitton then married a rich heiress. They are. Gave up medicine and moved to London, becoming a full-time geologist, and was twice elected president of the Geological Society, where one of his great contributions was to promote the importance of William Smith to the aristocratic and rather exclusive Geological Society of London. But I like to think it was through meeting William Smith at the Bakers in Northampton that William Fitton got to know William Smith. Next, we come to another important geological name, Professor William Buckland, Professor of Geology at Oxford University. We know from George Baker's account of the death of William Smith that George and the professor accompanied the coffin from Hazelrig House to the church and then to its burial in St. Peter's churchyard. And it was, yes, there's the burial stone in the churchyard. And it was Buckland who organised the collection for the commission of the bust of William Smith by the sculptor Matthew Noble, which stands to this day in St. Peter's Church. William Buckland was the friend and supporter of Mary Anning, the fossil hunter from Lyme Regis in Dorset. But we also know from Buckland's archive at the Natural History Museum in Oxford that Anne Baker was in correspondence with Buckland. Those of you who know Jay's old chemist shop in the Drapery or the obelisk at Boughton will have observed the unusual Northampton white sandstone originating from the quarry where Chatham Avenue now is. Anne Baker was puzzled by this unusual stone, um, and wrote to Professor Buckland in 1835. I'm sorry I have been prevented from sending the accompanying specimens of this Kingsthorpe sandstone sooner. There are 2 quarries on each side of the Harbour Road. I have added a specimen from the quarry on the hill, about half a mile to the east, which is extensively worked for lime and paving. It abounds with fossils, but there are none in the other 2. But you will observe a good deal of decayed vegetable matter in the white sandstone. So she was puzzled by this unusual stone, with its evidence of part plant roots, which you can observe both at the obelisk and, if you look carefully, at Jay's chemist shop. This stone sort of hardens on exposure to the air. So that suggests a friendship between Buckland and the Bakers. We don't have any evidence that Anne Baker and Mary Anning ever met. But in George Baker's histories, one of the fossil fish found at Bugbrook is compared with a fossil fish from Lyme Regis. Do know that Anne Baker and Mary Anning were both in contact with Louis Agassiz. He was the Swiss-American scientist, a great collector of fossil fish, and whose book, Poissons Fossiles, was one of the great Victorian geology texts. But he also went on to identify that the Earth had been subject to periods of glaciation, and he visited Britain accompanied by Buckland. We know he knew about Anne's fossil fish from 2 references in Poissons Fossiles. And we've got this amazing drawing this is a drawing from George that is included in the George Baker book, and also we have another drawing by Anne Baker in the this is a full page illustration, pencil illustration by Anne Baker, and Agassiz refers to this specimen with clearly labelled on white paper. So, did Anne Baker meet Louis Agassiz when he was accompanied and going across Britain with Professor Buckland? I think it's possible. So, some gaps in our knowledge. I'd really like to know whether the Bakers had what contact they had with their contemporary Spencer Compton at Castle Ashby. He was a renowned collector of minerals and fossils, and certainly bought fossils from Mary Anning. But we have no evidence of them meeting, and I'd really like to make some connection there. And the other question I've got is, what about Anne's education? Did she attend the tutor that her brother attended? And finally, we have no pictorial depiction of Anne, no picture. Surely there must somewhere be some depiction of Anne. It would be very nice to find it.
Oh, okay. Hello, everyone. My name's Kayley Porter, and I look forward to giving my talk on Anne Elizabeth Baker. So, Anne Elizabeth Baker, Word, Stones and Poetry. I'm going to open with a quote from Anne herself from the beginning, from the preface of her first book. I twine the hope to be remembered in my line, with my land's language, by no ere they fade away, the words and sports of yesterday. These words, written by Anne Baker in the preface to her glossary of Northamptonshire words and phrases, beautifully captures her hope that her life and work would leave a lasting impression. Yet, despite her significant contribution, Anne Baker remains an often overlooked figure in Northamptonshire's history. Anne Baker was not just a woman of her time, she was a woman far ahead of it. Born in 1786, she was a linguist, a restorer, and supporter of historical scholarship. Her work spanned multiple disciplines, reflecting a deep dedication to preserving both the tangible and intangible heritage of Northamptonshire. Anne's achievements are remarkable. She painstakingly compiled the glossary of Northamptonshire words and phrases, published in 1854, documenting over 5,000 local dialectic terms. She proudly noted that her glossary included more than 2,000 words and phrases not found in any previous publication. It remains one of the most comprehensive dialectic studies of its time. She also played a vital role in supporting her brother George Baker in his monumental History and Antiquities of the County of Northampton. This ambitious project was published in parts over a span of decades, starting in 1822 and finishing in 1841. 1841. Anne contributed to this work by assisting with field research, creating precise sketches and providing logistic and we hope moral support. Despite their dedication, the financial burden of the project forced George to sell his library in 1842. Anne's legacy also includes her pivotal role in restoring the Norman carvings of St. Peter's Church here in Northampton. So how can we better understand Anne Baker's life and achievements? Over the next 20 minutes, I'll explore her story, her scholarship, and her collaboration with figures such as her brother George Baker and the poet John Clare. Together, they worked in preserving the rich cultural tapestry of Northamptonshire and leaving us a legacy that we can continue to celebrate today. In 1823, St. Peter's Church was the shadow of the architectural gem we admire today. Its intricate Norman carvings had been hidden under layers of plaster, and the church had fallen into neglect. This is when Anne Baker's restoration journey began. Over the course of 11 years, from 1823 to 1834, Anne Baker dedicated herself uncovering the church's hidden Norman features using a simple boning knife. She painstakingly removed the plaster by hand, revealing carvings that had been concealed for centuries. These carvings included intricate scroll work, foliage, birds and beasts, and remarkable details that brought the church's Norman heritage to life. Anne's work wasn't just physically demanding, it must have been a labour of love. The meticulous care she applied, ensuring these carvings were preserved for future generations. Her efforts were described as pioneering during a time when historical preservation wasn't yet widely valued. Anne's work preserved these key features, and the efforts directly influenced the larger, and we hope her efforts directly influenced the larger scale restoration led by Sir George Gilbert Scott, building on Anne Baker's foundational work foundational work in uncovering the Norman carvings, restoring St. Peter's Church, leading to the restoration in 1850 to 1851. His work included replacing the flat roof with a striking oak timbered design featuring ornamental king post, restoring the west wing to its original Norman form, adding a sacrium built on the old foundations, and ensuring the interior flooring, seating and layout was updated to reflect historical integrity and the need of worshippers. Anne's restoration work at St. Peter's was just one example of her contribution to Northamptonshire heritage, and her commitment to preserving history extended beyond architecture, as we can see in her work documenting local dialects and supporting her brother George Baker's historical research. Anne Baker's contributions to the history and antiquities of the county of Northampton are overshadowed by her brother George Baker's more visible role, yet her involvement was vital. Known for her meticulous nature and artistic skills, Anne's efforts underpinned much of the project's success. While George's dedication earned him the nickname the Accurate Baker, it was Anne's invaluable contributions that also ensured the project's depth and richness. George Baker was a historian and an antiquarian dedicated to documenting the history of Northamptonshire. His History of Antiquities of the County of Northampton aimed to be a comprehensive record of the county's history, including manners, geology, natural history, and notable figures. The project had begun in 1850 and its first part was published in 1822. It took over 2 decades to produce 1/4 of the planned work, with its publication in 1830, 1836, and partial completion in 1841. George conducted meticulous research, visiting parishes, sending questionnaires to clergy, and indexing findings. However, the project's ambitions proved costly and exhausting, eventually forcing him to sell his library in 1842. Despite these challenges, George's work remains a cornerstone of local history, and the collections were later deposited at the Bodleian Library. There we go, the Bodleian Library. By 1842, the immense cost of the project forced George to sell his library. Despite the setback, Anne, supported both practical and emotional, ensured the work continued as far as possible. There we go. Oh, sorry. In 1854, Anne Baker published her Glossary of Northamptonshire Words and Phrases. This 2-volume work is a contribution to the study of regional dialects, documenting over 5,000 local words and expressions. Anne's glossary is more than a linguistic record, it is a cultural preservation project. It captures the essence of rural Northamptonshire life by recording the language of quarrymen, our agricultural workers, and everyday people. For example, we can see some examples from her book. Mully, to bellow as a cow. A mully cow, the name used by and 2 children for a cow. One of the unusual Pursers to induce a reluctant child to walk in a field. Come on, let us go and see the mully cow. And other such examples. Anne's preface reveals her meticulous approach. She wrote, "I have spared no pains to ascend and define the precise meanings from printed authors and especially early poets and dramatists." Her annotations connect dialectic terms to works by literary giants like Shakespeare and Chaucer, adding depth and historical context to the glossary. To bring the glossary to life, Anne sought over 180 subscribers to fund their publication, a subscription model that had previously been successfully used by her brother. Her subscribers include prominent figures such as Charles George Young, the Garter of the King of Arms, Sir Frederick Madden, keeper of the manuscripts of the British Museum, Sir Charles Edmund Isham, a Northamptonshire landowner and historian, and the Earl Spencer, who had ordered 5 copies. Their support reflects Anne's standing as a respected scholar in her field. Anne Baker's glossary received widespread acclaim at the time, praised by local and national publications for its originality and depth. The press highlights. The Manchester Daily Examiner described, we must only say that Miss Baker appears to have been particularly qualified by nature for her task and by circumstances to have an unusual opportunity for procuring it. The Brighton Gazette, we have pursued the glossary with a particular interest, not only for its talent displayed by the authoress, but also for its actual and intrinsic merit. I can't see where the next one is because it's on my screen. Every page exhibits considerable archaeological knowledge and extensive research. This work has not been a labour of a year or 2, but more than half a lifetime. Anne Baker received for her work. Despite the praise Anne Baker received for her work, her legacy has been overshadowed by her brother George's Baker's more prominent recognition. A clear example of this would have been the disparity between the disparity that can be seen in the Dictionary of the National Biography. Anne's entry spans just 142 words and is briefly acknowledged as her extensive but is acknowledged as an extensive knowledge of the antiquarian subject. However, George's entry spans over 331 words. It provides a more comprehensive account of his contributions, highlights his role in the leading figure as a leading figure. The imbalance reflects the historians call the Matilda effect, a phenomenon where women's contributions are systematically undervalued or attributed to men. Coined by the historian Margaret W. Rostier in 1993, the term highlights how women's intellectual labour is overlooked, even when it is a foundational. Anne Baker's story echoes another local experience, Rosalind Franklin, the brilliant molecular biologist whose work was central to the discovery of the DNA double helix structure. Franklin's X-ray diffraction images were pivotal, yet Watson, Crick and Wilkins received the 1962 Nobel Prize for the discovery, while Franklin's contributions largely remained unacknowledged at the time. Both Franklin and Baker exemplify how historical narratives have often marginalised women, leading their legacy to be undervalued. For Anne, her meticulous fieldwork, artistic contribution and organisation skills were integral to the success of her work and George's, yet it's often been framed that she is assistant rather than a collaborator. By revisiting these stories, we can ensure that Anne Baker's contribution are given the recognition they deserve, placing her alongside Northamptonshire's most important historical figures. Anne's glossary remains a vital resource for understanding the language and culture of the 19th century Northamptonshire. Her dedication to preserving regional dialects ensures that these words and the stories they tell can continue to be heard. Anne's passion for preserving local culture also connected her to the literary world. One of the most notable intersections was her collaboration with the poet John Clare, whose contribution to her glossary added a unique artistic dimension. Let's explore that next. One of the most fascinating rediscoveries about Anne Baker's glossary of Northamptonshire is her connection with the renowned Northamptonshire poet John Clare. This collaboration was brought to light through press mentions of her glossary, like with the Brighton Gazette noted how Anne incorporated Clare's poetry to illustrate local dialects. Let me go. This collaboration highlighted not only their shared appreciation for Northamptonshire's culture, but also Anne Baker's ability to bring together the academic and the artistic. This is it. We can see just a short description about who John Clare is. John Clare, often called the peasant poet, was one of the most authentic voices of the 19th century rural England. Born in 1793 in Hepstone, Northamptonshire, Clare grew up in a farming family, working as a labourer while developing his poetic talents. He captures the essence of rural life, its landscapes and tradition and dialects, and reflects a deep love for the land and the poetry. Clare's dedication to documenting disappearing culture and dialects made him an ideal collaborator for Anne Baker. His poetry and her glossary share a common mission to preserve Northamptonshire's cultural heritage at a time of rapid change. Anne Baker's glossary includes a poem by Clare celebrating the tradition of May Days. Written specifically for the glossary, it paints a vivid picture of rural celebrations. It is quite a long poem, so I will just read the first couple of stanzas, if that's okay. How beautiful May, and its morning comes in. The song of the maidens, you hear them begin to sing the old ballads while cowslips they pull. With the dew of the morning fills many pips full. The closes are spangled with cowslip like gold. Girls cram their aprons with baskets can hold, and still gather on to the heat of the day till they force off and throw the last handful away. Then beneath the old hawthorn they sit one and all, and make them May garlands and round cuckaball of cowslips and blossoms so showy and sweet, and laugh when they think the swains they shall meet. The collaboration between Anne Baker and John Clare underscores their shared commitment to preserving the traditions and dialects of Northamptonshire at a time when industrialisation was reshaping rural England. Their work highlights the importance of documenting local languages and customs before they disappeared. By including Clare's poetry, Baker elevated her glossary beyond linguistic resource. It became a cultural artifact that bridges theology and literature. Its connection also attracted literary and historical interest, ensuring her work resonates with a broader audience. The rediscovery of Anne Baker's collaboration with John Clare enriches our understanding of her work. It shows her ability to connect the scholarly and the artistic, positions her both culturally a historian and a preserver of Northamptonshire heritage. Together, Baker and Clare's legacy have continued to illuminate the voices, words and traditions of 19th century rural England. And as we come to a close of Anne Baker's story, her legacy reminds us of the profound impact one individual can have on preserving the identity of a community. Her work speaks not only of her intellectual and dedication, but also her deep love of Northamptonshire history and culture. Anne's achievements are remarkable. Through her glossary, and her capture of over 5,000 words and 2,000 unique ones, many of these vanishing in the face of rapid social change. Her restoration of St. Peter's Church, revealing the intricate Norman carvings that might have otherwise been lost to time, ensuring that the church's beauty would inspire future generations, and her collaboration with John Clare, showcasing her ability to bridge the scholarly and artistic and to celebrate the traditions and language of rural life. Despite the changes she faced and the bias of her time, Anne's contributions continue to resonate with us down the ages. To conclude, I would like to leave you with Anne Baker's own word from the preface of her glossary. "'Tis ended, but my hopes and fears begin, nor can I imput as a sin in me to wish it favour." I think these lines reflect her vulnerability and hope that her work would be valued and remembered. And today we reflect on her life. Let us recognise the lasting imprint she has left on Northamptonshire heritage. Yes, thank you very much.